Scott Rasmussen, we'll start there. Go to scottrasmussen.com, the number one pollster in America. Now, if you can only predict to me who's going to win the World Series and say it's my team, that would be a lot better. And he is joining us now. Go to scottrasmussen.com. Scott, great to have you with us.
John, it's great to be with you. And, as you're well aware, my job is not to tell you what you want to hear. It's what you need to hear. And the really bad news for you right now is that Luis Severino is returning to the Yankees. He's starting next week for the first time.
Well, you've won all these games with one of your number one pitchers out. We have not done that. We've got a couple hitters out. Correa's been out for about 4 weeks now, and Gurriel is out for this series with Oakland. But we've got the A's exposed. The A's exposed some real problems we have in the back end of the bullpen. So I'm getting a little more nervous than I was a couple days ago. But let's just, before we get into the politics, can we both mutually make fun of the Boston Red Sox for a minute? Can we do that? They fired Dombrowski. They went from champs to chumps, first to worst, winners to whiners. What do you think about this whole thing?
Well, there is nothing that warms the heart of a Yankees fan more than that, so I'm happy to join you in that. Although, I've got to tell you, I grew up in an era when the Red Sox had never won anything, so I think the rivalry used to be much bigger on the Red Sox fan than it is on a Yankees fan. It's only in recent years when the Red Sox have won a few times that the Yankees have felt like, hey, this is a serious rivalry. But, yes, it is wonderful. I think they will be officially eliminated from the playoffs within a couple of days, and that is great news.
It is.
I'll throw in one other just little fact.
Yes.
To tell you, reminds me every time of how much baseball has changed. You're talking about the players who've been injured, and I'm talking about the Severino coming back. The 1927 Yankees, a few years before my time, but one of the greatest baseball teams of all time, other than changing the starting pitcher, had the exact same batting lineup all 150 games.
Who was this?
Everybody played every day. 1927 Yankees, they had 8 guys. They put them up, put them in the same order, put them in the same position. And baseball isn't there anymore. Baseball has a lot more concern about the athletes and giving them some time off, make sure that they're ready for the playoffs, and we're going to see a lot of that in the next couple of weeks, getting ready to tune up.
Well, the game has really changed, Scott, even since, I'm 61 years old. When I played in high school and college, it has really changed. We were taught to move the runner over, hit the top side of the baseball. Worst thing you do was hit a lazy fly ball. That was called a can of corn back in my day.
Yeah.
You wanted to hit gap to gap. You wanted to spray the ball. Now it's, you wanted your swing on top half of the ball. And now everything is launch angle, and the ball is definitely juiced. Verlander said it, and I agree with him. You look at the Twins broke the major league record in homers at the end of August, and with 8 guys you never even heard of. So the baseball is juiced. The game has changed. Basically, I remember Earl Weaver of the old Baltimore Orioles. He'd say, well, I just sit around and wait for somebody to hit a 3-run homer. That was a big deal back in the 70s. Now that's what everybody does.
Right. And it's tough for the fans as well. It's fun to see a home run. It's exciting, especially if you have a late inning comeback or a walk-off. But you don't see as much action on the bases, which certainly adds a big element to the game.
I don't like the game now with all these homers. It's different. I prefer, back in the day when you had 3-2 games, and if somebody got a base hit, it meant something. Now the games are 9-7. A base hit is one of 25 in the game, so it's just not as big as it was. But look, different styles. Either way, we've got the playoffs coming up, and it's going to be exciting. Scott Rasmussen, as always. Now, Scott, before we get into some of your polling here, I assume you watched the Democratic debate last night. I just graded Joe Biden as the big winner because he looked halfway competent. And what was up with Bernie last night with all hunched over, screaming into the mic, and he didn't press his suit, he didn't comb his hair. What was up with that?
Well, I think first off, you're right. Joe Biden, it was a good night for him, primarily because nothing changed. And I've also got to point out that probably the most important fact about the debate was something that we found in a Job Creators Network survey just a few days beforehand. Only 21% of Americans even knew it was coming this week. This idea that people like you and I who are in the political world, that everybody is watching this and they're waiting to decide how they're going to vote is just ludicrous. Most of the people who watched last night were already fans of one of the candidates. So yes, I think the Biden folks breathing a little bit easier. I think Bernie Sanders appears to be a little flustered, not quite sure what to do with Elizabeth Warren, in the sense that they are obviously number 2 and 3 in all the polls. Whether you're talking about state polls or national polls. They share some common policy grounds. And Sanders, I think, believes that should be his space, and he can't quite figure out why he's not growing a bigger base and why Elizabeth Warren keeps hanging around. Beyond that, Beto O'Rourke and Andrew Yang had some great reaction on social media, which you would expect for some of their positions, but it's not really going to change anything. For all that we talk about the importance of the debates, the reality is it's those votes in Iowa and New Hampshire that are going to shake up this race, and especially after the performance last night. Biden showed he's not going to go tottering off to the nursing home as some of the others would like him to do. He had a stronger performance, and he is still an unconvincing front runner, but still the front runner for the Democratic nomination.
You know, I thought Sanders had a real opportunity last night, and maybe if you listened to it on the radio, you would have had a different impression. But the whole image of him my wife was watching it. My mother's 91, and she's all hunched over now. You know, that's what happens with right. Some as some people get older, not everyone. You know, Biden stood up straight. He looked crisp. His tie was red. He was a little tanned. Looked like maybe he played some golf. He looked fit and vigor. And, you know, Sanders was all hunched over, glasses down on his nose, didn't comb his hair, didn't press his jacket. Obviously, he was traveling that day. Jacket was wrinkled. Shirt was disheveled. And I know that's kind of a shtick, but I don't think you do it in that stage. And then he's like screaming into the microphone from the opening statement on. And I was like, he and I predicted he was going to be the nominee. I've now backed off that after last night. Because he just looked like a crazy old man.
Well, and look, the other thing was, it wasn't all that long ago, just a few months back, when every Democratic candidate was signing on to his Medicare for All plan. And then some of them read it and found that it really did include getting rid of private health insurance companies, and people have been backing off. And he doubles down on that. That's his issue. It's the only way we can do it. He is so committed to that, and I think he's, again, frustrated. Ironically, Elizabeth Warren sticks with him on that, but he got most of the flack for it. And that is, there are a handful of issues out there that are potentially real gifts for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. The whole idea of a Democratic candidate supporting the elimination of private health insurance companies is one of them. Joe Biden, again, on the more popular side of that issue, so he benefited from that exchange. But got to be very frustrating. Bernie Sanders expected that all the other Democrats really were as enthusiastic about his plan as they were when they first signed on, finding out that's not the case.
John Fredericks Radio Network, trucking the truth across America. We're with the number one pollster in America, Scott Rasmussen. You can follow him, sign up for his daily newsletter. Go to scottrasmussen.com. Also buy his book, The Sun is Still Rising, a very optimistic look at the future, which I like. I like optimism. You'll enjoy that. You can get it on Amazon or your favorite bookstore. The Sun is Still Rising by Scott Rasmussen. He's also a Yankees fan. Scott, let's get to, by the way, this segment is brought to you by the Job Creators Network or jobcreatorsnetwork.com, jobcreatorsnetwork.com. Scott, looking forward, a couple weeks ago when we were on you were on my show, Trump's approval ratings were inching up. Now, every poll is showing him over the last 2 weeks tanking again, back 35, 37%. Some of the polls have him. What happened in 2 weeks?
You know, what's been the biggest story of the past month is there was a market signal and a lot of media coverage suggesting that we might be heading into a recession. And we saw it dramatically in our Job Creators Network polling on economic confidence. For 3 straight weeks at the end of the summer, there were more people saying the economy was getting worse than better. We hadn't seen that since the government shutdown. You can tie it into the tariff wars, you can tie it into other things, but there was clearly a decline in economic confidence, and the economy is still. I did a pre-debate interview last night on television, and I made the observation that the toughest opponent for Donald Trump in 2020 is not one of the 10 people on stage, it is the economy. So if the economic confidence comes back, you'll see all of those things restored. And right now, this past week, we have seen a slight uptick, a slight reassertion of some economic confidence. And obviously, we're going to see what happens with China.
So the jawboning of the left and the fake news lying legacy media about a coming recession based on no information, certainly not based on the job numbers, inflation numbers, or a lot of other numbers. And by the way, the stock market, again, 1 or 2 day crash, rebounded. Nobody reports on that either. Certainly not the propagandists coming out of Goldman Sachs and the Wall Street Journal. So they jawbone the economy down. Trump's approval ratings takes a hit. There's no evidence that the economy is going to go into a recession. But the lying fake news media gets the objective, which is drive his poll numbers down. Don't you find that ironic?
Well, but you have to look at the other side of it. While people were losing a little bit of confidence in the economy, while that was dented, we kept asking them about their own personal finances, and people continued to be optimistic about their own situation. And in the long run, both politically and in perceptions of the economy, that's what matters more. If you have a situation, I mean, basically what happens is when there's a report that comes out that makes people nervous, they begin to get a little concerned about the economy. Then they look at what's happening in their own life, and if they're feeling good about that, and if no bad news comes for another 3 or 4 weeks, economic confidence will return. And I think that you have to recognize both that the media coverage, intense media coverage, can have a short-term impact on those numbers, but longer term, it's based on reality. It's people who work for companies that are growing tend to feel better about the economy. The more that things are actually growing, the better people's perception of it will be over time.
Unbelievable. Some of these numbers.
And by the way, John, I should also point out, there's a variety of polling techniques, and some people poll all adults, and some people poll sporadically at different times. If you run a poll on the night when the stock market crashes, several hundred points, and there's a lot of gloom and doom, the president's numbers will be impacted by that single night. One of the things that we do at ScottRasmussen.com is we report the president's job approval over a 3-day period, so you don't get a single-day impact. We have a very large sample that we work with, about 3,000 people in that survey, and we also focus on registered voters, not all adults. And when you look at it in that perspective, if you go all the way back to the end of January until now, the president's job approval has stayed in a 4-point range. It's somewhere around 46%. Sometimes it's a couple points lower. Every now and then it inches up a point or two higher. But the overall perception among voters of this president we live in a polarizing world. We live in a politically polarized and partisan world, and you either love Donald Trump or you hate him. And nothing has fundamentally changed that dynamic.
So can he get reelected if he stays at 46% approval? 46%
is the borderline. You got to remember that in addition to the 46%, there's another few percentage points of people who disapprove of him, but who think that things would be worse if Hillary Clinton had won the election. So that gets him very close to that 50% level. Got to remember that they're going to be the last time around when he won the presidency, 10% of all voters voted for him despite thinking he was unqualified for the job. If this was a question of, do you want Donald Trump to be the next president, and you have a 46% approval rating, the answer is no. If the question is, do you want Donald Trump or fill in the blank, whoever the Democratic nominee is, then it becomes a choice. And some people will say, I don't like either option. I'm going with the lesser of two evils. Some will be enthusiastic. And as we learned 4 years ago in a very close election, surprises can happen.
You never know, but I tell you what, your polling has been consistent. As you say, he's been within 4 points of 46 for a long time. You're the number one pollster based on accuracy in America. But you look at some of these other polls that CBS puts out and others, and the president is at 35%. And you say, how can there be an 11-point difference between ScottRasmussen.com and, say, Emerson or CBS or NBC? I mean, how do you get that big of a difference on a consistent basis? And so when people see that, they look at your poll and their polls, and they're like, okay, what is the difference here? Is it just that the way you do yours is more accurate?
Well, it's one of the great things. People are very good at when they find a poll they don't like, they're willing to find another poll that disagrees with them, and so therefore until they find one they like. And that cherry picking is exactly what you shouldn't do. A poll of registered voters is likely to be a little more favorable to the president than a poll of all adults. On top of that, there's a million details that go into a survey, but let me just give a very simple one. Most polls, when they ask you, do you approve or disapprove of the president, they also give you an option to say not sure. I happen to believe that everybody who is a registered voter in this country has at least a soft opinion of Donald Trump, so we don't give them that option. They must tell us, do you somewhat approve or somewhat disapprove? They got to give an answer to that. So we're getting a result from about 100% of people, whereas other polls are maybe getting a result from anywhere from 93 to 96, 97%. What that means is both the approval number and the disapproval number is a little bit higher in our poll. I think the thing to watch for is, take a page like the Real Clear Politics Average. It shows somewhere in the low 40% range to the mid 40% range is where the president has been consistently. And you just have to watch where those numbers go over time and be especially alert for if there's polling theory says there will be an outlier, 1 out of every 20 polls that happens. You should also be aware if something particularly big in the news happens. It usually takes a few days before that sorts itself out. So I think right now the key remains what's going to happen in the U.S. economy. That's the biggest question about election 2020. If we're in a recession or if things are going badly, the president will not be reelected. If the economy is doing very well, the Democrats will enter the race as a slight underdog. The second question is, who do the Democrats nominate? And I think once you get beyond those two questions, the rest we're going to have to wait and see how it plays out.
Final question is concerning the new poll you did on the Republican nomination for president, which was interesting. In May, there was only one challenger, and that was Bill Weld. The president led him in your polling 73 to 7%. Now there's three candidates in, and the president is at 74, 75?
76%. Yeah, we've done this a couple times. We did it once when it was just Bill Weld, once when it was Joe Walsh, and now with Mark Sanford in the race. And the president's numbers are steady. He's right now at 76%. All that happens is the anti-Trump candidates split the anti-Trump vote. So in our three surveys of this race, those opposed to the president have ranged from 6 to 8%. And it's not a case of addition. You get another challenger and you take some votes away from the president. They're taking votes away from each other at this point.
So basically, you got three people dividing the 6% that don't like Trump instead of one. That's basically the bottom line. I mean, there's no. What do you think? I'm out of time, but just very quickly on politics. What do you think about some of the states Republican Party just canceling primaries altogether, like South Carolina and several others just canceled it to save the money? Do you think that was a right thing for them to do, or do you think they should let these people spend the money, get on the ballot?
In the current era, they should let the primaries go on because the primaries have acquired a degree of public legitimacy. I'm a big fan of an older era. I don't think there should be so many primaries to begin with, but these cancellations don't stem from that kind of reasoning. And I think if anything, it will have it'll create some negative feedback for the president, but really very little impact on 2020.
John Fredericks Radio Network. I want to thank Scott Rasmussen for being with us. Follow Scott. Go to scottrasmussen.com. Sign up for his free newsletter. Comes right to your inbox every day. It's my favorite thing to get. It makes me smile. scottrasmussen.com. Scott hung up on us. That's because I'm an Astros fan. And he knows he's got to hang up because he knows when the playoffs come, we're going to kick their butt. John Fredericks Radio Network.